So we are going to begin by picking up in the middle of the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. In class on Tuesday, we discussed what schizophrenia, schizophreniform, brief psychotic, and schizoaffective disorder are all about. They essentially have the same symptoms, but their duration and severity is what makes them different. And schizoaffective was different because it also had the mood disorder symptoms at the same time. The disorder we didn't quite get to in class was delusional disorder. So this is where we're going to pick up. So delusional disorder is characterized by having only the symptom of a delusion. And there are some different categories of delusions that are common. Erotomanic or erotomania is one type of delusion with this particular belief that's where a high status person loves you. So you may think that, the president is secretly in love with you, or some famous actor or actress is really in love with you. Grandiose delusions are where somebody has an overinflated sense of self. They think they're much more important than they really are. Jealous delusions are also fairly common in relationships. Someone with a jealous delusion is suspicious of the behavior when there's really no just cause for being suspicious. And persecutory is where somebody thinks that everybody's out to get them. Not quite to the point of the paranoia with paranoid type of schizophrenia, but still that others are out to get you. And then the last type of delusion you can have is a somatic delusion, and this is delusional beliefs about your bodily functions or some sensations. What makes delusional disorder different from the other psychotic-based disorders is that this is the only symptom that a delusional disorder has. So they don't also have hallucinations or the grossly disorganized behavior or the negative symptoms or any of those other things. It's just delusions. You can also have something called a shared psychotic disorder. And in a shared psychotic disorder, you can actually share delusions with another person. It's pretty rare to have the delusional disorder diagnosis, but it's very common to have delusions as a symptom. So if you think about people who are in relationships with others and are jealous when they shouldn't be, they may not meet the full criteria for the delusional disorder, but they certainly have some symptoms. The people with delusional disorders tend to be able to function much better, and as a result, there's a much better prognosis than with schizophrenia. When we look at the statistics related to schizophrenia, it affects about 1% of the population, and as we talked about in class, it usually develops in early adulthood. It can develop at any time, but early adulthood is the most common time. Once schizophrenia develops, it's generally chronic. So most people will go through episodes where they are more psychotic, less psychotic, more psychotic, but they tend to be impaired for the rest of their lives. They also have a reduced life expectancy, in part because they don't take very good care of themselves. Now, schizophreniform disorder, on the other hand, is much more rare, so its percentage is about 0.2%. Interestingly, schizophrenia is a particular disorder that affects males and females about equally. So if you think about all the different disorders we've talked about in class, it's actually been rare to have ones that are both male and female roughly equal. Bipolar and schizophrenia are two of the bigger exceptions. The age of onset does differ slightly between males and females. Males tend to develop schizophrenia a little bit earlier, so late teens, early 20s, up to the mid-20s. Females a little bit later, late 20s, early 30s. Females have a better long-term prognosis, and we think that this is due in part to the later onset. So they have a much more well-established adult life, a much stronger social support network in place, and that probably helps to contribute. Another important thing to note is that in the past, we looked at some culturally normal behaviors in some subcultures, and we labeled them as psychotic or schizophrenia. So it's really important when you're looking at somebody else's behavior to make sure that that behavior is normal or not normal for their culture, not your culture. So I want to talk next about the etiology of schizophrenia. And so as a part of this, I want to talk about this onset age. So we just talked about the 20s is the time when people are most likely to develop schizophrenia. And so that would be this onset phase when they have the symptoms that are severe enough, consistent enough to meet the full criteria for schizophrenia. Now, most of the time, if we look at that person during the preceding roughly 5 to 10 years before they had the full criteria for the psychotic episode, what we find is that they were having some unusual behaviors or symptoms, not enough to meet the full criteria, but they certainly were showing some signs that something might not be totally normal. And if we go even further back and look at early childhood in people who later develop schizophrenia, what we see is sort of a general diffuse set of impairments. And so that nothing really severe, so some mild motor delays, some mild cognitive problems, learning disabilities, attention difficulties, maybe some problems with their social relationships with their peers. And so all of this starts to suggest that schizophrenia maybe is seen for the first time in the 20s, but that's the end result of a process that's been going on that person's whole life. So now let's get into the causes of schizophrenia, the etiology. Well, one of the biggest is going to be a genetic vulnerability. But this is not going to be a single gene, but it's actually polygenetic, meaning that there's more than one gene that influences the development of schizophrenia. We also see that schizophrenia tends to run in families. We don't believe that people are directly inheriting schizophrenia, but much like the other disorders we've talked about, they inherit a tendency or a vulnerability for schizophrenia. The degree of risk, how much risk you are at for developing schizophrenia, depends on how closely you are genetically related to the family member with schizophrenia. So let's go forward one slide and then we'll come back for a second. So if we look at the concordance rate, so the rate at which people are diagnosed if they have a relative, what we see is that there's a really high rate if your identical twin has schizophrenia or if both of your parents have schizophrenia. If you look at dizygotic twins, non-identical twins, or offspring where there's just one schizophrenic parent, the rate drops really far down. So this is suggesting a little bit about maybe some recessive dominant genes that are at play here. Now, the other interesting thing is that, let's say my identical twin has schizophrenia and I don't, and we both have children. Both of our children are at equal risk. It doesn't matter if I have the diagnosis or not. And this is kind of best explained with this slide. So if you have two identical twins, one is schizophrenic, one is not, this is the risk that their offspring will develop schizophrenia. Pretty much identical. If you look at non-identical twins, one has schizophrenia, one doesn't. The one who does have schizophrenia, their children just as high as the identical twins. But the other twin, the twin that doesn't have schizophrenia, the rate is much, much lower. So this is really pointing at genetics playing a big role, and that those genetics are giving people a vulnerability, but not a guarantee that that person will develop schizophrenia. But even if you don't develop schizophrenia, that vulnerability could be passed on to your children. So some other research that we have done is looking at trying to figure out which genes specifically are related to schizophrenia. And so what we'll do is we'll look for genetic markers. We'll look for how people with schizophrenia may have other problems that aren't directly related to schizophrenia but suggest maybe a dysfunction or an anomaly on a particular gene. And these are looking at linkage and association studies. And this research really points to the fact that it's more than one gene. There's not a single gene smoking gun out there. One of the types of research that's had some interest is on endophenotypes. And with this, we're looking at something called smooth pursuit eye movement. So if you ask people to follow a moving object with their eyes, we're looking at how smoothly their eyes follow that object. Do they kind of jerk and catch up and jerk and catch up, or are they able to follow it smoothly? And so we see that both people with schizophrenia and their relatives have problems with smooth pursuit eye movement. We've also done some of these studies looking at the ability to identify emotions in others, and that also seems to be related to schizophrenia in some way. So this is the chart that has the data on the smooth pursuit eye movement, and you can see people with schizophrenia, big impairment, their relatives who have some schizophrenia, but maybe not full-blown schizophrenia, so maybe something like a schizophreniform or brief psychotic. And then as you get further away in terms of symptomatology, you see the problem is not quite so severe. Okay, another part of the cause of schizophrenia appears to be related to dopamine. So again, when we've talked about neurotransmitters, we've always had this conversation of which comes first, the chicken versus the egg. We don't know if the dopamine is a symptom or a cause or a bit of both. But the reason why we are aware of dopamine is because the types of drugs that can trigger schizophrenic-like behavior, these would be agonists for the neurotransmitter that's related to schizophrenia, are all things that stimulate dopamine. So L-Dopa is a drug prescribed for people who have Parkinson's disease, is one such drug. Amphetamines is another. When we look at the types of drugs that reduce schizophrenic-like behavior, those are things like the antipsychotics we'll talk about later. Those are all dopamine agonists. But to say that it's just dopamine and only dopamine has been overly simplistic. It doesn't give us a complete picture of what's going on. And so current theories are looking at more than just dopamine, but also looking at the different types of dopamine as well as glutamate.